Now, a moment ago, you were saying that every language game has to be understood from the inside. One consequence of this is as follows, isn't it? Whereas the old logical positivists who'd been influenced by Wittgenstein's early philosophy were extremely dismissive of all religious talk, for example, and they thought that if I said something like God exists, that was just meaningless noise, exhaust. The later Wittgenstein would have not been intolerant in the same way. He would not have dismissed religious talk as being empty of meaning. What he would have said is, well, let's first of all examine how words are used in a religious context, how they function. Let's look at their use. Let's, as it were, get inside the religious language game, as he would have put it, and see how these terms are being used, and then we can judge whether they're being used legitimately, not legitimately, or whatever it might be.
Well, you have to be very careful about that last bit. You see, because what Wittgenstein would say is, it's not our task as philosophy to appraise the success or failure of the religious language game. All we can do is describe how it's played. And the important thing is to see that it isn't played like the scientific language game. It's ridiculous, he thinks, that we should take religious utterances as if they were sort of second-rate scientific utterances for which there was inadequate evidence. And he was always anxious to insist, well, we ought to look at the role that religion and religious utterances play in people's lives. That's the meaning of these utterances, to see what sort of a role they actually play in people's lives. And he disliked the idea that we should over-intellectualize this and make it into some kind of a theoretical enterprise where what we were concerned to was to criticize this and see if the evidence for the existence of God was up to snuff by scientific standards. He didn't like that. W.G. Grace once jumped on a chair in a meeting and said something Wittgenstein really approved of. He thought this was wonderful. Grace said something like this. He said, God doesn't want a head. Any old cabbage will do for a head. What God wants is a heart. Now, Wittgenstein liked that because he thought that was the language game in action. That was not trying to get outside it and do some sort of pseudo-scientific appraisal.
Yeah, but it is important, I think, for us to make the point that he didn't take a sort of anything goes attitude. I mean, he did think that philosophical puzzlement is characteristically caused by our using the terms from one language game as if they belong to another. By, for example, trying to judge, as I think you just said, trying to judge, say, moral talk or religious talk as if it were scientific talk. And that having got ourselves into these puzzles and problems, the way to get ourselves out of them was to pay very strict attention to the way the words that we were using normally functioned in
I think that's right.
In actual human discourse.
And he does have various ways that he summarizes this. He says philosophical problems characteristically arise when we take the word out of the language game, where it's at home, and then try to think of it as something sublime. We want to inquire into the nature of the good, the true, or the beautiful, instead of just looking at how these words are actually used in the language game.